Welcome to Geo Wars Explained, where every war is not just a story. Disclaimer: this channel provides commentary and analysis on historical and crumps.
For 2,000 years, the standard history of the Roman Empire has told us the same story. Rome's.
How do you stop an empire that has conquered the entire Mediterranean world? You don't do it by winning a single battle. The Roman Empire was not an engine of conquest for its own sake. It was a highly calculated machine designed to convert conquered territory into revenue.
Into Northern Europe because it was defeated. That explanation is too simple, and it is wrong in the way that simple explanations of complex systems are always wrong. The standard account points to the Teutoburg Forest in Rhine, where 3 Roman legions were destroyed in a Germanic ambush, and declares that this single battle broke Roman nerve and fixed the Rhine as a permanent frontier. This account mistakes a symptom for a cause. The legions at Teutoburg were not the last resource Rome possessed. Rome had the manpower, the treasury, and the organizational capacity to replace those 3 legions within a decade. The question is not why Rome lost a battle. The question is why Rome looked at Northern Europe, absorbed the loss, and made a calculated decision never to return in force. That decision was not made in grief or fear. It was made in arithmetic. The Roman imperial system was not an engine of conquest for its own sake. It was a machine that converted territorial acquisition into revenue, and revenue into military capacity, and military capacity into further acquisition. This cycle had a specific requirement. Every province added to the empire had to generate more in tax revenue, agricultural surplus, and trade income than it cost to garrison, administer, and defend. The Mediterranean world satisfied this requirement at almost every point of expansion. Northern Europe did not. The lands beyond the Rhine and Danube presented Rome with a calculation that never resolved in the empire's favor, not because Roman commanders lacked ambition, but because the physical and economic characteristics of the region made profitable incorporation structurally impossible under the administrative model Rome possessed. The first constraint was the land itself. The Mediterranean basin, including Gaul, Iberia, North Africa, and the Levant, was organized around river valleys, coastal plains, and existing urban networks. When Rome absorbed these territories, it absorbed functioning agricultural systems, established trade routes, and populations already accustomed to surplus production and taxation. Northern Europe beyond the Rhine presented a fundamentally different landscape. The great Germanic forests were not merely thick. They were an operational environment that invalidated the core assumptions of Roman military logistics. Roman armies moved on roads. Roman supply chains depended on the ability to move grain, equipment, and reinforcements at predictable speeds along predictable routes. The forest eliminated predictability. It compressed columns, negated cavalry, and turned every advance into a supply problem that compounded with each additional kilometer. Geography alone, however, does not explain why Rome could not simply clear the forest over time, as it had transformed other difficult landscapes. The second constraint was settlement pattern. The Germanic peoples of the 1st and 2nd centuries did not organize their populations in cities or even in the kind of nucleated agricultural villages that Roman administration required to function. Roman taxation, Roman census systems, Roman judicial administration, and Roman grain collection all depended on a settled, innumerable population concentrated in identifiable locations. The Germanic population was dispersed, semi-mobile in its agricultural practice, and organized in tribal kinship structures that had no fixed administrative center Rome could capture and convert into a provincial capital. There was no city to take. There was no treasury to seize. There was no single point of political authority whose submission would produce the submission of the surrounding population. Rome had encountered resistant populations before, but those populations had always possessed the structural characteristics that made eventual incorporation tractable. The Germanic North did not. However, the absence of urban structure might have been overcome through extended military occupation and forced settlement, a process Rome had applied in other contexts. The third constraint removed this option. The economics of extended garrisoning in Northern Europe were structurally negative. A Roman legion required approximately 10,000 tons of grain annually to sustain its operational capacity. In the Mediterranean provinces, this grain could be extracted from local agricultural surplus through taxation. North of the Rhine, no such surplus existed at the scale required. Every legion stationed in a permanent northern camp was a legion whose supply had to be imported, either from Gaul or from across the Rhine by river barge and wagon train. This import cost was not a temporary inconvenience that would normalize once the province was pacified. It was a permanent structural feature of the region's agricultural capacity. The soil, the climate, and the farming practices of the Germanic North could not generate the density of surplus that Roman military logistics required. The math did not improve with time. The fourth constraint operated at the level of strategic substitution. Rome's military commitments were not fixed in number. The legions were a finite resource allocated across competing theaters. The eastern frontier, the Danube line, North Africa, and the internal security requirements of the empire all placed constant demands on Roman military capacity. Every legion committed to a permanent northern expansion beyond the Rhine was a legion unavailable for the Parthian frontier, the Danube, or the suppression of provincial revolt. Roman strategic planners, operating within the constraints of a pre-industrial empire with finite logistical bandwidth, faced a genuine allocation problem. Northern expansion required not one or two additional legions, but a sustained commitment of forces sufficient to pacify a non-urbanized, heavily forested region of indeterminate size against a population that could disperse, regroup, and re-engage indefinitely. The opportunity cost of that commitment, measured against the military requirements of more strategically valuable theaters, was prohibitive. The fifth constraint was administrative depth. Roman provincial government functioned through a layered hierarchy of Roman officials, local aristocrats absorbed into the Roman administrative class, and existing municipal structures repurposed for imperial use. This model had worked in Gaul precisely because Gallic society possessed a pre-existing aristocratic class with fixed property, identifiable social authority, and a material interest in cooperating with Roman administration. The Germanic tribal structure produced no equivalent class. Germanic leadership was personal, military, and contingent on ongoing performance in war. It was not hereditary in the Roman sense, not tied to fixed landholdings, and not dependent on the administrative infrastructure that Roman co-optation could leverage. Rome could not buy the North the way it had bought Gaul, because there was nothing in the northern social structure that could be purchased at the price Rome was able to pay. The escalation logic that made these constraints irreversible emerged from the nature of Germanic resistance itself. Each Roman attempt to establish a permanent presence beyond the Rhine generated a military response that was proportionally more expensive than the territory being contested was worth. The Germanic tribes did not fight in set-piece engagements where Roman tactical superiority could be applied decisively. They dissolved before Roman columns, denied fixed battle, and attacked Roman supply lines, outposts, and separated detachments. Defeating this kind of resistance required not a campaign, but a permanent occupation at force densities that the economics of the region could never support. The only way Rome could have broken this cycle was by committing an overwhelming and sustained force that would have drained military resources from every other frontier simultaneously. No Roman emperor after Augustus was willing to accept that trade-off, because no Roman emperor after Augustus could do the arithmetic and find a number that worked. The moment of lock-in arrived not at Teutoburg, but in the decade that followed. Augustus, in the aftermath of the battle, had the option to recommit. He chose not to. Tiberius, his successor, conducted punitive expeditions across the Rhine under Germanicus that demonstrated Roman military capacity remained intact. Those expeditions won battles. They destroyed Germanic settlements, they recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards, and then Tiberius recalled Germanicus and ended the campaign. The reason given in ancient sources is that the campaigns were producing diminishing returns at increasing cost. This was not political timidity. It was a strategic assessment that the campaigns, however successful tactically, were consuming resources that the empire needed elsewhere and generating no durable administrative structure that could convert military success into provincial revenue. Winning battles north of the Rhine produced no province. It produced only the requirement for more battles. The Rhine-Danube line that became Rome's permanent northern frontier was not a line of defeat. It was a line of rational resource allocation. Everything to the south and west of that line could be held, administered, taxed, and defended at a cost the empire could absorb. Everything to the north and east of that line required a sustained investment that the economic and logistical characteristics of the region would never allow to generate a return. The frontier was not where Rome stopped winning. It was where the Roman cost-benefit calculation permanently inverted. North of the Rhine, the empire could expand indefinitely and gain nothing that its administrative system could convert into lasting value. South of the Rhine, the empire held territory whose productivity could sustain the armies that held it. What the Rhine frontier represents, examined without sentiment, is the outer edge of a specific kind of political economy. Rome did not run out of soldiers or courage or organizational capacity at the Rhine. It ran out of a particular kind of landscape, a particular kind of social structure, and a particular kind of agricultural surplus that its administrative model required to function. The Germanic North was not unconquerable in the pure military sense. It was economically uninhabitable for a Mediterranean imperial system built on urban administration, surplus extraction, and the perpetual conversion of conquered productivity into military power. The forest did not stop Rome. The forest simply made visible, in the starkest possible terms, the structural limits that had always governed where the Roman system could operate and where it could not. Those limits did not change. The Rhine remained, the empire remained within it. Not because Rome chose restraint, but because the system had no rational instruction for what lay beyond.
New updates.